Lieutenant Ken Taylor had been dreaming about being on a beach with two beautiful blondes when he was jolted awake. Naturally, he was a bit surly as he started to wake up. "What the fuck was that?" he exclaimed. One of the other pilots that he shared a room with was on the floor, clutching a broken wrist. "Mike, how bad is it?" he asked at the same time as he dropped from his rack. "Hurts," was all he said. Lieutenant Taylor looked at the other two pilots he bunked with. "Let's get him up and to sick bay," he said. Lieutenant Harris and Todd nodded in agreement, but then the klaxon sounded. "General quarters, general quarters. Man your battle stations. This is not a drill," blared out of the speakers. Another jolt told them what the first had been, the impact of a capital ship-size weapon. Lieutenant Taylor took a couple of steps and opened the hatch of their room. As he peered out, he saw a pair of crewmen running down the hall. "Hey, both of you come here," he yelled. He noticed they were thinking about ignoring him until they saw he was an officer. They stopped and turned back towards Lieutenant Taylor. "We have an injured man. Get him to sick bay on the double," he ordered. While the two crewmen helped Lieutenant Barnes to his feet, the three pilots didn't even bother to get dressed before exiting the room and sprinting to the hangar. They'd just be changing into their flight suits anyway. Years of practice allowed the pilots to navigate the passageways while avoiding other crew members or dashing their brains out on the top of the hatch doors. They leaped over the last threshold and entered the pilot locker room. They slipped into their flight suits and boots, exiting into the hangar. "Luck," Lieutenant Taylor shouted to his bunkmates before sprinting to his Starhawk fighter. 18 meters long and 10 meters wide, a pair of helix thrusters for the main drive and multiple navigation thrusters along the ship surfaces allowed her to spin 360 degrees along any axis. Two swept wings contained the missile launchers. 4 autocannons in the nose and 2 underside medium railguns mounted ventrally rounded out the armament. It was easy to see their design was influenced by 21st century fighter jets. The look was more for the pilot's morale than functionality. No one ever felt like a hero flying a glorified basketball. "Pilots, man your planes," came over the PA. Tradition dies hard in the Navy, and while barely flying like the fighters of old, they still referred to them as planes. Upon reaching his plane, a pair of crewmen helped Lieutenant Taylor finish getting his flight suit ready. Make sure all the seals are closed, remove the plugs that keep the sensor ports clean when not in combat, check the contact points, and help him into the cockpit. Another pair plugged in the wires that would link him to his plane, practically making them one. He donned his helmet but left the visor open for now. As he ran a quick systems check, the crewman finished by attaching his oxygen tubing to his flight helmet. A light tap on his shoulder said they were done and started to lower the canopy. "Happy hunting, sir," one of them said. While his plane was pushed into the launch tunnel, he checked his flight suit was properly pressurized with no leaks. He waited his turn as the TSS Reliant launched all of her fighters. Acceleration pushed him back into the seat as he was flung into chaos. Human tracer rounds mixed with alien energy weapons crisscrossed the gap between the two forces. The fire was so intense that even the agile fighters were exploding from lucky or unlucky shots depending on which end of it you were on, of the enemy capital ships. The tack nets were alive with chatter as the pilots tried to form up on their leaders. And then one voice cut through the chatter. "What the hell? Those are Kinzel ships." Another voice asked, "Aren't they supposed to be our allies?" Canned the chatter. The CAG's voice ordered, "Worry about that later. Echo and Black Squadrons, suppression runs on enemy weapon emplacements. The rest of you on me. Stay with your wingmen and let's go mix it up with them." The CAG calmly finished. The Reliant was one of the few ships to get all her fighters in the air, which left the human pilots outnumbered 2-1, or as one pilot called it, a target-rich environment. 80 Starhawks drove straight into the heart of the enemy's formation and scattered them like a flock of geese. Squadrons split into elements and elements into pairs as the fight broke into a swirling mass of chaos. You were either predator or prey in this dance of death. They say that in space, no one can hear you scream. But that wasn't true of the tac nets. Orders, cries for help, cussing, and screams of the dying were all jumbled. Little flashes of light marked the destruction of fighters on both sides, and death cheered and clapped from the sidelines, calling for more. Lieutenant Taylor had lost his wingman while he was doing his best to kill and not be killed by an enemy pilot. It wasn't until his foe was an expanding cloud of debris that he noticed it. He looked for someone to hook up with, but an onrushing pair of enemy fighters changed that plan. He took down one of them with a pair of Shrike missiles, and then he had a new dance partner. The space around the Reliant was one of barely controlled chaos. Fighters swirled, pounced, and chased each other, all the while trying not to be killed by AA fire from both sides. Capital ships hammered each other with their main and secondary batteries. Missile launchers emptied almost as quickly as they were reloaded, and wreckage and bodies marked the loss of another life. The Kinzel pilots were very good, but the Terrans were better. They were angered at the betrayal and fought with a ferocity that Kinzel couldn't match. Lieutenant Taylor had to return to the Reliant to rearm once and was wondering if he would need to do it again. But flesh and blood can only take so much pounding before it gives, and the Kinzel were the ones that finally broke with the death of their supercarrier. The remaining fighters retreated to their surviving ships and jumped out. The few fighters left behind made suicide runs at several ships, with one hitting the Aurora. And then the tac nets were silent, and only the calls for help on the S and R were heard. All fighters, return to ship was sent by the Reliant, and then repeated by the surviving squad and element leaders. Lieutenant Taylor waited for his turn to land with priority given to wounded pilots and heavily damaged ships. It was always a relief to return home safely. He waited patiently as the ground crew unhooked him from his ship before exiting the cockpit. It was his first chance to see what kind of damage he'd suffered, and it wasn't pretty. Holes and scorch marks were all over his ship, but nothing major. Lieutenant Taylor turned to his crew chief. "What's the casualty count?" Chief Simmons grimaced as he replied, 22 confirmed dead, 18 MIA, and I don't have an exact count of wounded yet. At least 10 birds won't ever fly again." "Shit," the alt replied. "Any casualties on the flight deck crew?" The lieutenant could hear the frustration and barely suppressed grief in his reply. 7 dead, 16 wounded. Most when a bird crashed and exploded while landing. "Fuck." The lieutenant replied in the same tone. Clapping the chief on the shoulder, "I need to report in, but we'll get together later to hoist a glass to our fallen." "Yes, sir, and glad you made it," Chief replied. On his way to change out of his flight suit, he noticed several planes that weren't assigned to the Reliant. Closer inspection indicated they were from the Nebula. Some of the last of her crew. As he walked through the hatch, he saw Lieutenant Harris and walked over to greet him. "Harris, glad to see you made it. Where's Todd?" Harris just shook his head in response. "Damn it. Any idea who else? I lost Green early in the fight." Lieutenant Taylor continued. "Jackson, Gonzalez, Dixon, and Noburo are the only ones I know." Lieutenant Harris replied. There were going to be a lot of empty racks on the ship after today. Many of them had been friends. All he wanted now was a shower, some food, and some rest. But there were still so many things to do before he could sleep. Not that he would sleep, but instead replay the fight in his head over and over, wondering if he did one thing differently, then maybe one less bunk would be empty. But first, a shower to loosen the stiffened muscles gained by dogfighting enemy fighters.